Hi, I'm Elle Wadsworth and I'm a PhD student.
Hi, I'm Dave Hammond, a professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Waterloo.
On October the 17th, 2018, non-medical cannabis will be legalized in Canada, only the second country in the world to do so. In order to capture the Canadian policy experience, we have interviewed many stakeholders across the country prior to legalization.
The series will cover how cannabis will be regulated, changes in the cannabis industry, and why Canada legalized cannabis in the first place.
So the proposed regulations are to restrict cannabis advertising and promotion similar to tobacco. And so what that means is that it should only be communicated in adult-oriented venues. So that could be in a bar where you have to be, 18 or 19, the same as the drinking age. It could be direct mail, and it can't be lifestyle-oriented or child or youth-oriented. So it should be based only on the information of the products. Canada's been very explicit about the goal is not revenue generation. I mean, that will be a part of it, but it's about public health. And really, if you ask the question, well, what public health purpose does allowing that type of marketing serve? I can't think of any. Companies will still be able to compete with different branding, with different product characteristics, but as I said, it's very difficult just to promote product characteristics and not have that increase appeal of the product more generally. So this is a big experiment. There's support in Canada, but there's also a lot of skepticism. And so I think, you can call it a precautionary approach, but we've certainly learned from tobacco that it's easier to loosen restrictions over time than it is to claw it back. And so I think it's a reasonable approach to be a little bit more conservative in terms of what types of advertising and marketing to allow. We know from decades of research and internal tobacco company documents and other industries that it's the young people who are most susceptible to that type of brand imagery that may increase primary demand. And that is one of the primary goals of the whole framework, which is to actually minimize use among youth and young adults. So I think the proposed restrictions are consistent with the government's objectives, and it's something that I think the industry will just have to learn to work within.
The industry, I think, has been making two arguments about this. One is that they can't compete with the black market if they're not allowed to advertise their products, which to me seems a bit disingenuous insofar as think about Ontario, for example. It won't be difficult or challenging in the slightest to know where to get your legal cannabis. It'll be at the Ontario cannabis stores. Their locations will be certainly well known or findable. The other piece is the idea that, well, alcohol isn't held to those standards, so why should cannabis? And that's a really interesting point in the sense that, part of the, one of the things we said in our cannabis policy framework was that for most adults, cannabis is a less risky substance than alcohol. But I think that we ought to reframe this and think about the ways in which alcohol is under-regulated.
MedRelief's response to Health Canada's proposed approach to regulation of cannabis. MedRelief has always supported a responsible, measured approach to legalization and regulation of cannabis use in Canada and appreciates the government's cautious and thorough approach to legalizing and regulating the industry. Nonetheless, we have concerns with the announcement from Health Canada and the Department of Justice in their summary of comments received during the public consultation report released on Monday the 19th of March. As a dedicated corporate partner in the delivery of legal and regulated cannabis products, we firmly believe that adult-focused product packaging will also better differentiate legal products from black market offerings, thereby serving a fundamental public policy objective. But that last point is very important, right? Because if one of the policy objectives of the Cannabis Act and what we discussed earlier was to migrate this black economy around cannabis products into the legal market, you're going to need to be able to give consumers signposts like, why does somebody purchase a Coke versus a Pepsi? What is it about taking this sort of product and bringing it into the legal market that people will make consumption decisions based on branding, advertising and the ability to differentiate between what is and is not legal product.
When people say that they'll have trouble distinguishing, I wonder if they even know what they're talking about in terms of what plain or standardized packaging looks like. It has government mandated health warnings, other information, it has child-proof packaging, and I have never seen anything on the private illicit market that looks anywhere remotely close to it. Never mind the fact that you need to buy legal cannabis from dedicated retail outlets. So it's an argument, again, that's been used in the past. I think there's no merit to it whatsoever. Yeah, so standardized packaging is basically a recognition that packages are a really, really important form of marketing and promotion. It's amazing what you can communicate on a package, and you can use a package to target who your user group is. So if you think of a female-oriented cigarette or male-oriented, well, that's largely determined by the packaging. The shape and size of package, it can increase appeal, and it can also communicate perceptions of risk, whether you think one product is more or less harmful than another. So we know it's important. Standardized packaging is to try and minimize the extent to which the packaging appeals to young people, associates with lifestyle advertising. So you won't be allowed to have a celebrity endorsement. There's restrictions on claims. And so the idea is that people will see the product and the information, but it also helps to steer people's attention towards the health warning. And standardized or plain packaging, as people call it, it's in place for a number of countries for cigarettes. And what will be the case in Canada is just a little bit less than that. So again, they'll allow them to use some different colors. They'll allow some limited branding and a logo, but there's restrictions on sort of the size. So it's kind of like plain packaging-ish. And I think, it may be implicit, but the government probably tried to position it relative to what will be standardized or plain packaging for cigarettes in Canada. In other words, the health burden from tobacco is so much greater than cannabis that they're being a little bit less restrictive for cannabis products. And I think that was a good test of just how far the government was willing to restrict advertising and promotion that would be appealing to young people. And it's a pretty good start at trying to frame this as a public health measure rather than just revenue generating.
I do believe that the tobacco regulation is warranted and justified. And I do believe that if you sell cannabis flower in a format that is encouraged to be combustible, like to be smoked, that kind of strict approach makes a little more sense to me. However, as we've previously said, with the exciting new developments in research and development and the sort of endless purview of what form this product can take in the coming years, insisting on this oppressive sort of packaging and labeling regime doesn't make sense. It actually defeats the public policy objective of trying to migrate people out of the unhealthier and illegal consumption methods into, formats that are going to be gentler on the body or could actually be, prove healthy in consumption. So I understand where Health Canada comes from in their policy document. At the same time, I hope that they are nimble and flexible and adaptable to seeing and investing in the sort of research that will corroborate sort of this thesis that combustibles are not the cannabis industry and the two should not be treated equivalently in the long term.
I think when you look at other drugs and substances as comparators for cannabis regulation, and you look at alcohol and tobacco, you have to look at what are the aims of regulating those substances and what are the public health principles that are at stake in those regulations. For tobacco, I think it's safe to say that really the public health goal is to stop tobacco use. There is no safe tobacco use. It really is, the objective is to get people to stop and quit and reduce the harms associated with tobacco in that way. Whereas with alcohol, there's a sense that there's a push more towards safe and responsible alcohol use. That there are ways to use alcohol safely, and that it's really not about quitting alcohol, it's about using it sensibly. Cannabis is an interesting drug that way, and I don't know that it's clear to everybody whether really the goal is to stop use and eliminate use, or whether we're in a context where we can actually talk about safe and responsible cannabis use for non-medical purposes. I think that the regulatory framework that borrowed from tobacco is mostly around branding and advertising and packaging.
If you think about the process for regulating tobacco, and even specifically advertising and marketing, that's been a 70-year process. In 2018, we are still bringing in new regulations on cigarette marketing in Canada. So the lesson from that is that it will evolve over time. It will evolve as industry practices change, as we think we know what the market's going to look like, but until it actually happens, it's hard to predict. So it will change over time. We've learned from tobacco that advertising and promotion is incredibly important, not just in terms of what brands people choose, but how people see the product and things like social norms, which dictates who uses the product, what type of products they use. So that is fundamentally important for something like cannabis, where we really haven't had much coordinated advertising and promotion other than maybe some online. So the lesson is that it is perhaps one of the most important components of cannabis legalization. It will adapt over time, but it's incredibly important that if this is to serve a public health objective, as it's supposed to, then it begs the question, well, what is the purpose of advertising in a public health framework? There are many other markets and countries that will look to Canada. And I think it's probably in the industry's interest to demonstrate that they can be a responsible industry in terms of how they advertise and market this product. And there's probably far greater payoff for them demonstrating that in Canada and having other markets open up than trying to really push both the technical and the sort of the principles underlying those advertising and marketing regulations. But we'll only know that once the framework and the market opens up and we see what the actual practices are.